The sand never leaves you. 20 years later, I still taste it in my dreams, gritty between my teeth, coating the back of my throat like a metallic shroud. But it's not the desert that haunts me. It's what we found in that crater 3 clicks south of Basra, and what James Morrison did about it. I was a Royal Army Medical Corps medic attached to 1st Battalion, the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment. 22 years old, fresh-faced, and absolutely certain I knew everything about trauma medicine. Iraq would teach me different. It would teach me that some wounds can't be bandaged, some screams can't be silenced, and some things that crawl out of bomb craters shouldn't exist at all. The morning of March 15th, 2003, started like any other. The air tasted of cordite and diesel fumes, that familiar cocktail of war that clings to everything: your clothes, your hair, the inside of your mouth. I was checking inventory in my aid station when Sergeant Williams burst through the tent flap, his face flushed with exertion and something else. Fear, maybe, or excitement. In war, they often look the same. "Morrison, Russell, get your kit. We've got casualties 3 clicks south." IED took out a patrol. James Morrison was already on his feet, slinging his medical bag over his shoulder with practiced efficiency. At 28, he was the senior medic, a career soldier who'd seen action in Northern Ireland and Kosovo. Where I was all nervous energy and textbook protocols, James was steady hands and hard-earned instinct. He'd saved more lives than I'd seen birthdays. "How many casualties?" James asked, already moving toward the door. "Unknown." Radio chatters garbled. "They're requesting immediate case vac." We loaded into the armored Land Rover with practice speed, James, myself, and Corporal Davies from a company who'd volunteered to drive. The vehicle bounced and lurched across the broken landscape, past palm groves and bombed-out buildings that looked like broken teeth against the horizon. The smell of burning oil hung heavy in the air, black smoke rising from a dozen fires scattered across the city. I had responded to dozens of IED calls by then. The routine was always the same: arrive on scene, assess casualties, stabilize the wounded, call for evacuation. Clean, efficient medical. I thought I knew what we were driving toward. I was wrong. The radio crackled to life as we approached the coordinates. "Bravo 27, be advised, situation at target location is unusual. Request you approach with caution." Davies glanced at us in the rearview mirror. Unusual how? But the radio had gone silent. We found Lieutenant Hartwell's patrol scattered around what had once been a section of road between 2 abandoned buildings. The blast crater was massive, easily 10 meters across and half as deep. But it wasn't the size that made my skin crawl. It was the shape. IED craters are chaotic things, irregular and violent, carved by the random fury of explosive force. This crater was different. It was perfectly circular, with walls that seemed almost polished, as if the earth had been carved away by some impossibly precise tool. The bottom was smooth as glass, reflecting the desert sun like a mirror. "Jesus Christ," Davies whispered, bringing the Land Rover to a stop 30 meters from the blast site. "What kind of bomb makes a hole like that?" James was already out of the vehicle, medical bag in hand, moving toward the casualties with his characteristic calm efficiency. I followed, tried to push down the uneasiness that was building in my chest. Something was wrong here. The air tasted different, metallic, sharp, like the moment before lightning strikes. Lieutenant Hartwell met us halfway, his face pale beneath a coating of dust and dry blood. "Thank God you're here. We've got 3 wounded, 1 critical. But there's something else." "Where are your casualties?" James interrupted, all business. Hartwell pointed toward a cluster of soldiers gathered near one of the abandoned buildings. "Private Jenkins took shrapnel to the leg, Corporal Matthews has a concussion, and Lance Corporal Smith." He paused, his voice dropping. Smith was closest to the blast when it went off. We found Smith 20 meters from the crater, conscious but in severe shock. His left arm hung at an impossible angle, clearly broken, and his face was a map of cuts and bruises. But what struck me most was his eyes, wide, staring, filled with a terror that went beyond physical pain. "Smith, can you hear me?" James knelt beside the injured soldier, his hands already working to assess the damage. "You're going to be fine. We're here to help. Smith's head turned toward James with jerky, unnatural movements, like a marionette controlled by an amateur puppeteer. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "It came out of the hole," he said. "It came out, and it looked at me." James and I exchanged glances. Blast trauma could cause hallucinations, disorientation, confusion. We'd seen it before. "What came out, Smith?" I asked gently, beginning to prepare a morphine injection. "Can you describe what you saw?" Smith's eyes fixed on mine with sudden, terrible clarity. "Not what?" he whispered. "Who?" While James worked to stabilize Smith's arm, I moved to treat the other casualties. Jenkins's shrapnel wound was straightforward. Clean entry. No major vessels compromised. Matthews was groggy from his concussion, but responsive. Standard battlefield injuries, the kind I'd treated dozens of times. It was while I was bandaging Jenkins's leg that I first saw it. Movement in my peripheral vision, down in the crater. I looked up from my work, expecting to see a bird or maybe debris shifting in the wind. What I saw instead made my hands freeze on the bandage. Something was climbing out of the hole. At first glance, it looked human, roughly the right size and shape, moving with the awkward coordination of someone injured or disoriented. But there was something wrong with the proportions, something that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. "James," I called quietly, not wanting to alarm the wounded soldiers. "Look at the crater." James glanced up from Smith's arm, following my gaze. I watched his face change as he saw what I was seeing. The professional calm that never left him, even in the worst situations, flickered for just a moment. The figure, I use that word because I still don't know what else to call it, had reached the rim of the crater. It stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly, as if getting its bearings. From our distance, it looked like a person in tattered clothing, covered in dust and debris. "Survivor from the blast," James said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Could be a local who was caught in the explosion. I wanted to believe that. God, how I wanted to believe that. But something deep in my brain, some primitive warning system that had kept our ancestors alive when they were prey animals, was screaming at me to run. The figure began walking toward us with slow, measured steps. As it drew closer, details became clearer, and those details were all wrong. Its gait was too fluid, too coordinated for someone who had just crawled out of a bomb crater. Its clothing appeared to be military fatigues, but they hung on its frame in ways that suggested the body underneath wasn't quite the right shape. And its face. "James," I said again, more urgently this time. "I see it," he replied, his hands never pausing in their work on Smith's arm. But I could hear the tension in his voice now, the same uneasiness that was making my skin crawl. The figure was close enough now that I could see its face clearly. It looked human at first glance. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth in all the right places. But the proportions were subtly wrong, like a photograph that had been slightly distorted. The eyes were too large, set too wide apart. The mouth was too narrow, the lips too thin. The overall effect was deeply unsettling, like looking at someone wearing a mask that almost, but not quite, fit properly. "Help," the figure said as it approached, and its voice was perfectly normal, perfectly human. "Please help me." Lieutenant Hartwell stepped forward, hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "Identify yourself. Name and unit." The figure stopped about 10 meters away, swaying slightly on its feet. I can't remember. The explosion, everything is confused. Standard response for blast trauma, except for one thing. There was no dust in its hair, no blood on its skin, no sign that it had been anywhere near an explosion. Professional training kicked in. Whatever this thing was, it was asking for medical help, and I was a medic. I grabbed my medical bag and started toward the figure, but James caught my arm. "Russell, wait. It's injured," I said. "Look at it." James studied the figure for a long moment. "Look at it," he repeated quietly. "Really look at it." I did, and that's when I noticed the first truly impossible detail. The figure cast no shadow. Despite the bright desert sun beating down on all of us, despite the clear shadows cast by every other person and object in the area, the figure stood in its own pool of unnatural light. "That's not possible," I whispered. "No," James agreed. "It's not. The figure took another step closer, and I noticed something else. Where its feet touched the ground, the sand didn't behave normally. Instead of leaving footprints, the sand seemed to ripple outward in perfect concentric circles, like dropping a stone into still water. "Please," the figure said again, and now I could hear something underneath its voice, like an echo or a harmonic that didn't quite match the words. "I need help. I'm hurt." Smith, still lying on the ground with his broken arm, suddenly began to whimper. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what came out of the hole. That's what looked at me." James made a decision. He stood up from beside Smith and walked toward the figure, medical bag in hand. I watched him approach with a mixture of admiration and terror. This was James Morrison, the man who would run into enemy fire to treat a wounded soldier, who would perform surgery in a bunker while mortars fell around us. Fear wasn't something he acknowledged, not when someone needed medical help. "Where are you hurt?" he asked the figure, stopping just outside arm's reach. The figure tilted its head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. "Inside," it said. "I'm hurt inside." James began his standard assessment routine. "Can you tell me your name?" I don't remember." "Do you know where you are?" "Iraq." "I'm in Iraq." "What's the last thing you remember?" The figure was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke again, its voice carried that strange harmonic more clearly. "The light. There was a bright light, and then falling. I remember falling for a long time." James nodded, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the wrongness that surrounded this patient. "I'm going to examine you, check for injuries. Is that all right?" The figure nodded, and James approached with his hands raised, moving slowly and deliberately. I watched from 20 feet away, every instinct screaming at me to grab James and run, but unable to do anything but observe. James reached out to check the figure's pulse at the wrist. The moment his fingers made contact with its skin, everything changed. James jerked his hand back as if he'd been burned. His face went white, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him, I saw genuine terror in his eyes. "Russell," he called without looking away from the figure. "Get on the radio. Now." "James, what?" "Get on the radio." The urgency in his voice snapped me out of my paralysis. I grabbed a radio from Davies and called back to base. "Base, this is Bravo 27. We need immediate evacuation for all personnel at these coordinates." "Bravo 27, what's your status?" "Are casualties stabilized?" I looked at James, who was still standing frozen in front of the figure. "Negative, base. We have a situation here that requires immediate response." "Clarify your situation, Bravo 27. How do you explain the impossible over radio? How do you tell your commanding officer that you've encountered something that shouldn't exist?" "Base, we have encountered something that requires specialist response. Request immediate evacuation and whatever support personnel deal with unusual situations." There was a long pause on the radio. When a voice came back, it was different, calmer, more controlled. "Bravo 27, maintain your position. Support is en route. Do not, repeat, do not engage with any unusual personnel you may have encountered. Maintain visual contact, but do not make physical contact." The change in the radio operator's tone sent a chill down my spine. They knew. Somehow, they knew what we had found. James was still standing motionless in front of the figure. I could see him trembling now, his medical bag hanging forgotten in his left hand. "James," I called. "James, step away from it." He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen before and never wanted to see again. James Morrison, the man who had saved dozens of lives under impossible conditions, looked broken. "It doesn't have a pulse," he said quietly. "It doesn't have a heartbeat, but it's warm. It's warm, and it's breathing, and it's talking to me, but it doesn't have a pulse." The figure had remained motionless during this exchange, watching our interaction with what might have been curiosity. When James spoke, it tilted its head again. "I don't understand," it said. "What's wrong? Why won't you help me? What are you?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure considered this question for a long moment, and when it answered, its voice carried new harmonics, deeper tones that seemed to resonate in my chest. "I am what I need to be," it said. I'm what you expect to find. The helicopter appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, moving with the kind of urgency reserved for the highest priority calls. But it wasn't a standard medical evacuation bird. This was a transport helicopter, and when it landed, the personnel who emerged weren't medics. They were soldiers, but not like any soldiers I'd ever seen. Their uniforms bore no identifying marks, no unit patches, no rank insignia. They moved with professional precision, setting up a perimeter around our position with practiced efficiency. The team leader approached Lieutenant Hartwell. "Lieutenant, I'm Major Reynolds. My team will be taking over this situation. Please gather your personnel and prepare for immediate evacuation." "What about our casualties?" James asked, finding his voice again. Major Reynolds glanced at our wounded soldiers, then at the figure standing motionless nearby. "Your casualties will be evacuated with you. The other individual will remain with us." "What other individual?" Hartwell asked. Reynolds pointed at the figure. "That one." I looked around at my fellow soldiers. The expression on their faces told me that they could all see the figure as clearly as I could. But Reynolds was acting as if we should know what he was talking about, as if encountering impossible beings was routine. "Sir," I said carefully, "what is your team's specialty?" Reynolds looked at me with eyes that had seen things they weren't supposed to see. "We clean up situations that don't officially exist, Medic Russell." The use of my name sent another chill through me. These people knew who we were, knew what we had found, and had arrived with suspicious speed. This wasn't a random response team. This was a specialized unit that had been prepared for exactly this kind of situation. "How did you know to come here?" James asked. "We didn't," Reynolds replied. "We've been here for 3 days, waiting." The implications of that statement hit me like a physical blow. They had been waiting. They had known something would happen at this location, at this time. The entire situation, the patrol, the explosion, our discovery, had been anticipated. "The ID?" I said slowly. "There was no ID. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Very good, Medic Russell." "No, there was no improvised explosive device. What created that crater is not something that officially exists." I looked back at the perfectly circular crater with its impossibly smooth walls. What it created? That's not information you're cleared to receive. 2 of Reynolds' team members had approached the figure during our conversation. Unlike James, they showed no hesitation about making physical contact. They placed some kind of device around its wrist. It looked like a bracelet, but it hummed with electronic energy. The moment the device activated, the figure changed. The subtle wrongness that had marked its appearance became more pronounced. Its features shifted slightly, becoming less human, more obviously artificial. The voice, when it spoke, carried no human warmth at all. Compliance mode activated. It said in tones that belonged to no human throat. "Awaiting instructions." "Jesus Christ," Davies whispered. "What is that thing?" Reynolds looked at us with something that might have been pity. "That is a question you're going to forget you ever asked." What happened next is difficult to describe, partly because my memory of it has been deliberately altered, and partly because some experiences exist beyond the reach of human language. Reynolds' team produced a device that looked like a cross between a camera and a medical scanner. They positioned it in front of each of us in turn, activating it with a soft electronic hum. When the device was pointed at me, I felt a strange, tingling sensation in my head, like the moment before you remember something important. "Standard memory adjustment protocol," Reynolds explained as his team worked. "You'll retain your memories of responding to casualties from an IED attack. The crater was caused by a particularly large device, possibly enhanced with captured ordnance. Your medical response was exemplary, and all casualties were successfully evacuated." I wanted to protest, to fight against whatever they were doing to us, but my thoughts felt sluggish, disconnected. The impossible figure was becoming harder to focus on, its features blurring in my vision. "The unusual aspects of this situation," Reynolds continued, "will be reclassified as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by combat fatigue. Perfectly normal, nothing to be concerned about. You'll recommend counseling for any soldiers who report unusual sightings." James made one last attempt to preserve what we had witnessed. "People need to know," he said, his voice slurred as if he were drugging. If there are things like this, if there are organizations that deal with them, people have a right to know. Reynolds looked at him with what might have been sympathy. Sergeant Morrison, people have a right to sleep peacefully in their beds, believing they live in a world that makes sense. What we do preserves that right. The memory adjustment device was pointed at James, and I watched his face relax as 20 years of impossible experiences were carefully edited from his consciousness. When it was finished, he looked around with the mild confusion of someone waking from a deep sleep. IED attack, he said, as if testing the words. Right. How are our casualties? Stabilized and ready for evacuation, Reynolds replied smoothly. The device was activated in front of me, and I felt my own memories reshaping themselves. The impossible figure became a traumatized civilian caught in the blast. The perfect crater became the chaotic result of explosive force. The wrongness that had saturated the entire experience faded into the background, reclassified as combat stress. But something went wrong with my memory adjustment. Maybe the device malfunctioned. Maybe my particular brain chemistry resisted the process, or maybe some part of me fought to retain the truth. Whatever the reason, I kept fragments, disconnected pieces of the real experience that would resurface years later in dreams and moments of déjà vu. Our after-action report described a textbook response to an IED attack. 3 casualties, all successfully stabilized and evacuated. The unusual size of the blast crater was attributed to captured ordnance, possibly an old artillery shell that had been incorporated into the device. Lieutenant Hartwell commended our medical response. James received a commendation for his work under fire. I was praised for my quick thinking and calling for additional support. The civilian who had been caught in the blast was listed as having been evacuated for treatment, though no record of his arrival at any medical facility ever appeared in official documents. Major Reynolds and his team vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving no trace of their presence except for a vague sense that something important had happened that we couldn't quite remember. For weeks afterward, all of us experienced the same symptoms. Strange dreams, moments of confusion, the nagging sense that we had forgotten something crucial. The base psychologist diagnosed it as combat stress reaction and prescribed counseling sessions that helped us accept the official version of events. James threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, as if trying to prove something to himself. He saved more lives in the months following the incident than in any comparable period of his career, earning him a transfer to a field surgical unit where his skills could be better utilized. I completed my tour in Iraq without any further incidents, at least none that I can remember clearly. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I would catch myself staring at perfectly circular puddles of water or trying to remember why certain shadows looked wrong to me. I left the Army in 2004 and returned to civilian life, using my medical training to become a paramedic in London. For 15 years, I lived with the vague sense that something important had been removed from my memory, but I attributed it to the general trauma of combat service. It wasn't until 2019, during a routine call to a construction site where a gas explosion had created an unusual crater, that the first clear memories began to surface. The crater was perfectly circular. Standing next to it, I felt that same primitive warning system activate, the same sense of wrongness that had made my skin crawl in the Iraqi desert. And suddenly, fragments of the real memory began to break through whatever barriers had been placed in my mind. I remember going home that night and writing down everything I could recall, afraid that the memories would fade again if I didn't capture them immediately. The fragments were disconnected and often contradictory, but they painted a picture of an encounter with something impossible. Over the following months, more pieces returned. I began to remember James's face when he touched the figure's wrist. I remembered Major Reynolds and his team of specialists. I remembered the device that had been used to alter our memories. Most disturbing of all, I began to remember other incidents from my time in Iraq, events that had been classified as routine but carried the same underlying wrongness as the crater incident. How many times had Reynolds' team arrived to clean up situations that didn't officially exist? How many impossible encounters had been edited from my memory? Armed with my recovered memories, I began to investigate the incident systematically. I tracked down the other soldiers who had been present that day, hoping to find someone else who had retained fragments of the real experience. Lieutenant Hartwell had left the Army and become a security consultant. When I contacted him, he was initially reluctant to discuss our time in Iraq, but eventually agreed to meet me at a pub in Manchester. "I've been having dreams," he admitted after several pints. "Dreams about things that can't be real. Sometimes I wake up with the feeling that I've forgotten something important, something that might be dangerous to forget." I shared my recovered memories with him, watching his face change as details began to resonate with his own suppressed recollections. By the end of the evening, we had reconstructed a fairly complete picture of what had really happened that day. Corporal Davies had been killed in Afghanistan in 2005, his death officially attributed to an IED attack. But Hartwell remembered Davies mentioning strange dreams and recovered memories in the weeks before his final deployment. He said he kept dreaming about something coming out of a hole in the ground, Hartwell told me. So it looked human, but felt wrong somehow. I told him it was just combat stress, that he should talk to the base psychologist. The more I learned, the more I began to suspect that Davies' death might not have been the accident it appeared to be. People who remembered too much, who broke through the memory adjustments, seemed to have unusually high rates of fatal accidents. James Morrison had been the most severely affected by the memory adjustment, possibly because he had made physical contact with the impossible figure. Tracking him down proved difficult. He had left the Army in 2006 and seemed to have disappeared from official records entirely. I finally located him through a veteran support network. He was living in a care facility in Scotland, diagnosed with severe PTSD and early-onset dementia. When I visited him, I found a man who bore little resemblance to the confident, capable medic I had served with. "The memories come and go," he told me during one of his lucid moments. "Sometimes I remember things that couldn't have happened. Sometimes I forget things that definitely did happen. The doctors say it's trauma-related, but I think someone did this to me deliberately." James's medical records showed a pattern of psychological deterioration that had begun shortly after our return from Iraq. He had been hospitalized multiple times for episodes of paranoid delusion, during which he claimed that his memories had been altered by unknown parties. "I keep trying to remember what I touched," he said, staring out the window of his room. "There was something I touched that I shouldn't have touched, something that felt wrong. But every time I get close to remembering, the memories slip away again." I shared my recovered memories with James, hoping to help him reconstruct what had really happened. For a moment, his eyes cleared with recognition. "The figure," he whispered, "it didn't have a pulse. It was warm and it was breathing, but it didn't have a pulse. How is that possible?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I want to find out." My investigation revealed a pattern of similar incidents stretching back decades. Military personnel who encountered impossible situations, memory adjustment teams that arrived with suspicious speed, and the systematic suppression of information about non-human entities. I found reports of perfectly circular craters in Vietnam, strange figures emerging from underground facilities in Korea, and mysterious specialists who dealt with situations that didn't officially exist. In each case, witnesses experienced memory loss, psychological problems, or fatal accidents in the months following their encounters. The organization responsible for these cover-ups operated under various names and classifications, but their purpose remained consistent: to prevent public awareness of non-human intelligence operating on Earth. Through careful research and the testimony of other affected veterans, I began to piece together the scope of their operations. They maintained facilities around the world, employed advanced technology that seemed decades ahead of anything publicly available, and had the authority to alter or eliminate witnesses to their activities. But most disturbing of all, I began to realize that the encounters they covered up were becoming more frequent. Whatever intelligence was behind the impossible figures was becoming bolder, more active, less concerned about maintaining secrecy. In 2022, I was contacted by someone claiming to be a former member of Reynolds' organization. The meeting took place in a crowded coffee shop in London, and the person who approached me looked like any other middle-aged businessman. "Mr. Russell," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. I understand you've been asking questions about certain military incidents. I studied his face, looking for some sign of deception or threat. What I saw instead was exhaustion and something that looked like regret. You were there that day, I said. You were part of Reynolds's team. He nodded slowly. I was a technical specialist. My job was to operate the memory adjustment equipment, to ensure that witnesses forgot what they had seen. Why are you contacting me now? Because the situation has changed, he said. The entities we've been concealing, the intelligence behind the figures your team encountered, they're preparing for something. The cover-up operations are being scaled back, not because the encounters are decreasing, but because concealment is no longer considered necessary. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Everything I can give you without compromising ongoing operations. Names, dates, locations of similar incidents. Use the information wisely. What's going to happen? Contact, he said simply. Open contact between human and non-human intelligence. The cover-up was designed to prevent panic while preparations were made. Those preparations are nearly complete. He stood to leave, then paused. Your friend James Morrison, his memory adjustment failed because the entity he touched marked him somehow. It left traces of itself in his consciousness, and those traces fought against the memory modification. He's not going insane, Mr. Russell. He's becoming something else. Armed with the information provided by the former specialist, I faced a decision that would define the rest of my life. I could accept the official explanation for what had happened to my team, live quietly with my recovered memories, and wait for whatever contact event was approaching. Or I could act on what I had learned. I chose to act. Using the names and contact provided in the manila envelope, I began reaching out to other witnesses, other veterans who had encountered impossible situations and lived with the aftermath. I found a network of people who shared similar experiences, similar gaps in their memories, and similar concerns about what they had forgotten. Together, we began to piece together a more complete picture of the non-human intelligence operating on Earth. The figures emerging from perfectly circular craters were not invaders or infiltrators. They were scouts, advanced observers preparing for a larger revelation. The intelligence behind them had been studying human society for decades, possibly centuries. They had the capability to appear human, to integrate seamlessly into our population, and to manipulate our perceptions and memories. But they were also preparing for a time when such concealment would no longer be necessary. The cover-up organization, rather than fighting against this intelligence, had been working in cooperation with it. Their role was not to prevent contact, but to manage it, to ensure that when open contact finally occurred, human society would be prepared to accept the reality of non-human intelligence. I continued to visit James Morrison throughout 2022 and 2023, documenting the progression of what the doctors called his dementia, but which I now understood to be something far more complex. During our conversations, James would sometimes speak in voices that weren't his own, using vocabulary and concepts that seemed impossibly advanced. He would describe technologies that didn't exist, social structures that defied human understanding, and perspectives on reality that seemed to come from a fundamentally non-human consciousness. They're not trying to hurt us, he told me during one particularly lucid episode. They're trying to help us evolve, to become something more than we are. But the process is difficult. Some minds can't handle the transition. What kind of transition? Integration, James said, and his voice carried harmonics that reminded me of the figure we had encountered in Iraq. Human consciousness is limited, confined to individual minds and brief lifespans. They offer expansion, connection to a larger awareness that spans time and space. I asked James if he wanted this integration, if he welcomed the changes happening to his mind. I don't know, he admitted. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself, like everything that made me James Morrison is being replaced by something else. But sometimes I feel like I'm becoming more than I ever could have been alone. The staff at James's care facility began reporting unusual incidents around him. Electronic devices would malfunction in his presence. Other patients would claim to see figures standing near his bed that the staff couldn't observe. And sometimes, late at night, James would speak to empty corners of his room, carrying on conversations in languages that didn't sound human. In December 2023, James Morrison disappeared from his care facility. The official explanation was that he had wandered off during a confused episode and had likely died of exposure in the Scottish Highlands. His body was never found. But I received a message, delivered through channels that I still don't fully understand, that told a different story. James had not died. He had completed his integration, becoming something that was simultaneously more and less than human. The message contained coordinates for a location in the Scottish Highlands, along with an invitation to witness what James had become. Against every rational instinct, I drove to the specified location, a remote valley surrounded by mountains, far from any human habitation. I found James standing in the center of a perfectly circular clearing, but he was no longer entirely James. His form flickered between human appearance and something else, something that hurt to look at directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the same impossible harmonics I had heard from the figure in Iraq. "Hello, Russell," he said, and despite the wrongness of his appearance, I could still hear my old friend in his voice. "I hoped you would come." "James, what happened to you?" "I remembered," he said simply. "I remembered what I touched that day, what it showed me, what it offered, and I chose to accept the gift." He gestured to the clearing around us, and I noticed for the first time that the ground was marked with patterns that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. "This is a preparation site," James explained. "One of thousands around the world. The time for hiding is almost over. Soon, everyone will have the choice I was given." "What choice?" "Evolution or extinction," James said, and his form solidified into something that looked almost entirely human again. "Your species stands at a crossroads. You can remain as you are and face the consequences of your limitations, or you can accept integration and become something greater." I asked James what integration really meant. What would happen to human consciousness and individuality? "Nothing is lost," he assured me. "Everything you are becomes part of something larger. Your memories, your experiences, your essential self, all preserved within a collective consciousness that spans galaxies and millennia." But even as he spoke, I could see the cost of his transformation. James Morrison, the man who had saved countless lives, who had faced impossible dangers with unshakable courage, was becoming something that was no longer entirely human. His compassion remained, but it was filtered through an alien perspective that valued the collective over the individual. James introduced me to others who had undergone similar transformations: former soldiers, scientists, government officials who had encountered non-human intelligence and chosen integration. They formed a network that spanned the globe, working to prepare humanity for the revelation that was coming. "The cover-up served its purpose," one of them explained. "It gave us time to prepare, to identify individuals who could serve as bridges between human and non-human consciousness. But that phase of the operation is ending. I learned that the perfectly circular craters were not the result of weapons or accidents, but of emergence points, locations where the non-human intelligence crossed from their realm into ours. Each emergence was an opportunity,